Keeping the real Reformation alive, one topic at a time. Doth protest, doth protest, doth
Hi, everyone. Thanks for listening to Doth Protest, a podcast on Reformation history and theology. This is Drew speaking. James and I are here. This is the first episode of the year of 2025. It is January 5th that we're recording, and we'll probably have this posted pretty quickly after that because we had nothing backlogged to be scheduled to be posted or anything like that. Um, we're joining you for the new year. And one of the things I've noticed that a lot of podcasts seem to do is that they do a sort of like, throwback reflection discussion of the last year. Often this takes the form of like what were the most listened to episodes of the year or something like that. And this podcast, of course, has been going since 2020 and it's come a bit of a ways. I mean, when I originally started it, it was, I guess, in the middle of a pandemic, and the pandemic looked different in many places where I was in the southern US. It lasted a few months, and then a lot of places were pretty adamant to reopen pretty quickly. But of course, it was felt different everywhere. And I kind of started it out of something as a personal self-interest in church history and in especially with the Reformation period, and that it's developed since bringing on James, for instance, as my co-host, who's here today. Hello, James, and I'll let you
Hey
talk.
Drew, what's
Yeah,
up?
I'm good, man, and I'll let you talk more in a little bit. So, and
All right.
yeah, and it's developed more into a podcast about, the reformational heritage, the reformational basis of Anglicanism, which James and I both, are priests within. That is our Christian tradition. And and just over the years we've been blessed to have lots of guests and to do a lot of episodes just on a lot of interesting topics. And so for this kind of bringing in the new year, we wanted to do like a reflection. Now I will say that we this podcast it's been around since 2020, but we have now been hosted by Podbean, and we're not like advertising for them. They're not giving us any money for this. But we go through Podbean now, and we've been through a couple other hosts in the past, but we've been with Podbean for a while. And now, because of that, when we look back at like past episodes and how many people listen to them and the stats on that, right? We don't really have a clear picture for the full 4 years of every single listener ever and every single number. But we do have a good view of the last couple years ish, little longer last couple of years. So for a significant portion of this podcast life and seeing which episodes were most listened to based on the numbers of our current podcast hosts of Podbean. And this is something I check time to time. Naturally, being the host of the podcast, I like to say, where are we at? What episodes, are people really tuning into? And to be frank, I still don't have an idea of like, it's kind of random. As you'll see as we go through the list, it's like, okay, oh, people like that one a lot more than the other. We don't really know how these are going to be received, always, but that kind of adds to the fun of why we thought a top 10 list, going through the top 10 of the, according to our most, our recent podcast hosts of the last almost half of the life of this podcast, the going through the data they give us of which episodes have spoke the most to people, we would say because of the just the number of listeners, um, the number of people who've tuned into them. So that we're going to go through these top 10, and that's kind of the agenda for our episode today. But James, you're joining me today, and I'm sorry I didn't mean to like disrespect you by saying I'll let you speak more in a little bit. I'm being like
It's all right.
very
No worries.
territorial podcast today, I guess. So, um, well, let's catch up, man. Like, let's spend a couple minutes. Like, I mean, the last time we had an episode, I think it was mid-December, the last time we recorded one. And a lot happened between now and then. This is, a new year has entered. We had Christmas and the holiday stuff. I'm sure in the life of the church where you serve, in the life of your personal life,
Right.
lots going on. So, catch us up on how you are, man.
Yeah, things are going well. Life at church is finally starting to slow down, which is helpful because it's been super busy during Advent and the Christmas season so far. Um, but yeah, it's to the good that we're able to have a little bit of a respite. But as I was telling you before the podcast started, Drew, we've got apparently a huge snowstorm coming in tonight and tomorrow. So, and our subdivision where we live has above ground utilities and they are not very well cared for. So it's good that we're recording this now instead of tomorrow because it's entirely possible that we're going to have no power tomorrow.
Oh my God. How much, um, how much, how often do you see snow where you are?
We get snow every year, at least once or twice. Last year was pretty tame, but the year before made national news because the exit where we are on I-95 got like completely hammered. We got like 16 or 18 inches of snow in about 4 or 5 hours.
Wow.
And it was gridlocked. There was ice. Trees were down. It was terrible. And we didn't have power for 4 days. And Rachel was pregnant at the time. So we ended up like getting out of the house and going and staying with her aunt up in Fairfax, which is in Northern Virginia. So
Well, you're just in this weird area of like I know I'm from Michigan, which knows snow all too well, and now I'm
yeah.
in Louisiana, who doesn't know what to do with snow. So I don't. I'm from like two opposite extremes. So you're like in this kind of mid part of the country
Yeah.
where it's like, yeah, you get some snow, you know it, but it's yeah. When it comes to I mean, do you have plows or
Yeah, yeah. So they plow and everything, but the problem is that we get not enough snow for people to know how to drive, but we get just enough snow where it causes problems.
yeah,
Like so that's where we are. We're in that really unfortunate sweet spot.
yeah,
Um,
unfortunate.
so
I like how you put that.
yeah, so we'll see how it goes. Hopefully it's not terrible. Rachel and I have been saying, we're thankful that we have our kids, but if we didn't have kids, it wouldn't be as big of an issue. But because we have kids and our kids are pickier when it comes to eating, if we lose power, it's going to be not super fun to have to figure out what they're going to eat and if they will eat and that kind of thing.
How
Uh,
long is it for you to drive to South West Louisiana from where?
yeah.
Oh, you
Well,
did it. You did that.
I did do it. Last time I did it, it took me about 16 hours of drive time, I think.
Oh Lord.
I did about 12 in one day and 4 in the next.
Hey man, our doors are always open to you at my house, and I'll open my church up to if that's not enough for you. Because our
Well,
house,
if we can actually get out of our driveway, then
I
great.
guess that's the key, right?
Right.
Well,
But
man,
we're prepared, so it'll be fine.
well, my prayers are with you, and if you have to go north to your family, well, you know, hope it works out. So,
Yeah.
so, yeah, I'm doing good. I just got back off from vacation. I'm kind of slowly finding my footing again, getting into the back into the routine of things. Went to Houston for a few days. You probably saw on Facebook, our we went to the Houston. No, the Dunham Bible Museum at
Yeah.
HCU, Houston Christian, which was really cool. Like just a small little museum on the grounds of the university. Where my wife and I were the only ones there. This was like our post, after all our services, Christmas stuff was done at the church. We went, did a little getaway, my wife and I, to Houston, um, and did a bunch of things. We went to see the Rockets and the Celtics. They played Friday night. And that was fun. First basketball game I've been to in a long time. I don't know if anyone follows basketball in here. I don't know if you follow basketball, James, but
There are a few sports that I like less than basketball. Tennis is probably one of them.
wow.
Uh,
I like basketball. I don't. I like it. I feel like because most people I know, no one I know follows it.
yeah.
Like, well, who do I talk with about it with? Whatever. So,
I mean, you can always talk with me about it. I just may have a blank stare on my face.
well, that's most people I know. So, especially in Louisiana, where everyone's like, it's either it's football,
Hmm.
Um, and so, but it was fun. But that was fun, and we went to that museum, and then we went out and ate at a bunch of places, and it was fun, good.
Nice.
But we're back, and we're back on this podcast, and I guess we'll go through the top 10. I think we'll start with and James and I were talking before the podcast. He was on a lot of these episodes. Of course, I'm the main host of the podcast, and sometimes James doesn't make it, and other times, there's been times I don't make it because of things, and James has been the main host of some episodes. But these are the top 10 according to the last since our existence of our current podcast host. And I have a feeling if we were to have the whole data, the top 10 would probably still contain most of these. And James has been on a lot of these, so he and I are going to speak to a lot of these. And even James, if a couple of these episodes you were not on, you can still speak fully to it. I want you to, like that would be great.
Sure.
I guess well, I don't know. This might be a good opportunity to spend a few minutes on before we get into it. Um, this podcast is reaching it's reached 4 years now. And James, you were initially like a listener of it. You and I knew each
Right.
other online because we're both like priests in the Episcopal Church. So we naturally, like, a lot of us find each other.
Right.
And I found you were a listener to it. And I think I was like, hey man, like, I was at a point, I think it was about a year in or a year and a half in, where I'm like, I want to bring on like several personalities for people to hear, like where it's not just me or me bringing on a guest. I want, because the best podcasts I listen to are like people that, despite whatever the subject matter is, it's just like I can relate to and connect with the people I'm listening to, and I like to just hear from them time to time. And that was kind of like I want some people like that, and
Yeah.
we connected personally, and I was thinking that. And so tell me, like, I don't know, what are your thoughts on this podcast? And like, you can speak freely. I mean, because I
Hmm.
created it, I didn't fully know what I was doing going into it, but here it is. It's been 4 years. I mean, what do you think's, strengths, no, weaknesses? I mean, like, what is this podcast about? What do you see as the mission of this thing that we've been both doing now for a few years? And tell us, I mean, share your thoughts on it.
Yeah. So the first episode I did was in January of 22, I think, because it was right before Rachel and I went on a baby moon before our youngest daughter, Abigail, was born. And yeah, I mean, I think in my reading of this podcast, we exist to be hopefully a calming word for people who are really exhausted with the legalism of the church today. I think we exist to be a voice crying out in the theological wilderness, trying to remind people of the heritage that we have from the Reformation that's worth our investigation and thinking back over what they taught us and restoring some of the things that we were taught that have been lost by, for instance, the First or Second Great Awakening. For us as Anglicans, the Oxford movement, the ecumenical movement of the 20th century. Each of those, I think, removed some really, really, really important um, pieces of our theology as Protestant Christians. I mean, the ecumenical movement and like the joint documents on justification and stuff like that really tried their hardest to remove sola fide from the heart of the Christian faith for Protestants. And that's one of the most disgusting things for me. Like that for me is a ditch I'm willing to die in. That's the sine qua non. Um, so I think one of the most important things that we can do is to continue doing episodes that are trying to approach the heart of the faith from a different reformational angle. But also some of the episodes I've loved the most have been the ones that where we've actually gotten into the nitty gritty of pastoral ministry in a Protestant church. Because that I think is something that people don't hear a lot of clergy talking about. Um, so, the episodes where we talked about how we preach or why we preach the way that we do, or how we approach theology in the parish, whether in preaching or teaching or conversation. Um, all of that, I think, are the strengths of the podcast. Um, I don't really think there are any weaknesses. If there were some things that I think, from what I've heard or from what I, just sort of have thought over the years might be helpful, would be some of the things that you and I were talking about in the pre-show conversation about, like having a series of conversations on a particular topic and digging deeper into things and focusing not just on having other people coming on the show, but also having conversations with the two of us. Because not to toot our horns, but I think in large part the reason why people listen to us is because they want to hear what we have to say.
No, I
Uh,
agree, I agree, man. Like, and no, it's not an ego thing for you and I. I think people, I- the people who have come back for another episode, beyond the one they listened to, have been because it's like, it's like obviously this isn't just an interview show where they bring on an expert of this or that, but it's like, Drew and James are they're both pastors, they both um have life stories, life journeys to share, and we've, you and I have shared quite a bit about it on this podcast in bits and pieces, and in some ways, I'm thinking back on the crossover episode we did with the reclamation, where you open up a lot about your own journey, going from back when to where you are now.
right,
I think a lot of people do want to hear from us, you and I, and I think and this is for our listeners, we will looking at especially this year 2025, there's going to be a lot of episodes of just James and I, just he and I discussing a certain topic, or just getting together for the heck of it, no agenda, or going over, because he and I both have large reading lists all the time, either for personal or professional reasons, or academic reasons, and just to share about those.
right,
And our thoughts and our insights, and people can take them for what they are, but yeah, I think, and again, that's not us bragging about us, you and I, but people do, especially like, devoted listeners want to hear that, and so I'm all about that. We do have a few guests lined up through March of this year, which we're really excited about. And as the episodes come out, I mean, I know our listeners will like a lot of the content because it's good, reformational content from some pretty top people as people see. But yeah, just to hear from us. And here because we're both pastors and we both, deal with the day in and day out of working in the real wider world of the lives of, our churches.
Right.
Yeah, people will, it's I think it's not all ivory tower. I hope. I
Right.
hope I hope this podcast is not all ivory tower. Some of our episodes have given that, impression a little bit. But I pray that, the reason why I mean I can't, as much further academic study as I've done, beyond, MDiv and stuff in my life. Like I hope that um, the reason why I started this podcast was because I feel that the things that Martin Luther and John Calvin poured over and struggled over um, were things that a lot of people, a lot of average people, and a lot of people in the churches struggle with or question or or strive to find some type of solace or foundation or something. And so I hope this podcast kind of brings the pastoral side of the Reformation alongside, the other, the significant ways in which it contributed academically, culturally, etc.
Well, and I think that's honestly the pastoral side is the heart of all of this. The academic flows forth from that. I mean, when it comes to like Luther posting the 95 Theses, the reason why he wanted to combat indulgences was because he felt like it was robbing his people, like monetarily and theologically robbing his people. And as their pastor, he knew that it was his responsibility to protect them.
Mhm.
So, like, the Reformation in some way was actually a pastoral move, a pastoral shift. So, like, I think that absolutely is it has necessarily been an essential part of what we've done, even when we're doing what you're saying, like the Ivory Tower episodes. It always has to come back down, feet on the ground for at least a little bit, because that's where the reformers were,
Mhm. Yeah. And we've been blessed to have some I mean, Robert Cole's been on this podcast.
right?
Mark Mattis has been on this podcast. Volker Lapine has been on the like, I mean,
Right.
oh my God.
Justin Holcomb. Justin Holcomb's
That's
been on
so,
the podcast.
yeah. And I mean, I was thinking like the Luther, like the super Luther, like these are like, but yeah, I mean, a lot of people have been on this podcast. I'm like, wow, all they did was reach out and ask, and these people graciously gave their time. And it's like, wow, how blessed are we? Like we were never names in anything. We were just interested, pastors slash students in ways that reached out to people and people gave their time. And so we're so thankful for that. And but yeah, the heart of this podcast is to get to the heart of what these concerns were about that the Reformation came from. And that's not that's things that are going to relate to everyone, to anyone, any Christian. And so that's, what I pray and hope we continue to be about. And yeah, I mean, thanks for sharing that stuff, James. I know I look forward to another good year here on the podcast about all that.
Yeah.
Do we want to get into the list? This is our top 10 list, most listened to episodes of our history.
Yeah. I mean, I don't know that we'll have time to honor our listenership. I don't know if we'll have time to get into all 10, but let's do it.
Are you on a time frame here?
Uh,
What's your time frame?
well, I just know that Rachel's probably gonna need help with kids with supper at some point, but yeah, we got some time.
We have 40 minutes.
Yeah, I think we could probably square that away.
Maybe 30. Okay. Number 10. And we're going from least to first. I don't I should have took account of like how many episodes we even published. But this is our top 10, and we're starting with the bottom. Number 10, the response to The Rest is History. Um, from the so this is the response to The Rest is History Luther series.
Right.
Uh, that it was just me. I did an episode where I responded to the Luther series that was done by the podcast. Uh, oh gosh, what is the name of that
The
podcast?
rest is history.
The Rest is History. Such a good, like, everyone says that. The rest is, yeah, there's a podcast, The Rest is History, it's hosted by Tom Holland, Dominic Sandbrook.
Yep.
Podcast I listen to a whole lot.
Me
I'm
too.
forced to say I just forgot the title of it.
Yeah.
And they did a six-part, or maybe it was a five-part series on Luther and the Reformation. And it
Yeah.
was very, very enjoyable podcast series. I encourage our listeners to listen to it. And I gave reasons to why this is a great podcast. However, I spent an episode responding to some of the points in it. And I felt maybe I was nitpicking at points, but James, that was one of those episodes I did without you. I just did it.
Yeah.
Did you listen to it?
I'm ashamed to say I didn't actually.
Yeah.
Um,
I don't know what to say about it, but other than I guess I encourage our listeners to go listen to it. I can't speak.
I guess one thing that can be said is that um, the rest is history is an excellent, podcast for history. It's a popular level podcast by two very accomplished historians. Tom Holland is not a credentialed historian. He's, I think, a journalist by trade, but is very, very well and broadly read. Dominic Sandbrook is a credentialed historian and is, they have great banter. In many ways, I actually feel like um, a lot of what we do is sort of mirroring
We're trying to
the
be them. We're like wannabes.
no, not wanting to be them, but like sort of by nature, we're doing some similar stuff because history is an integral part of what we're doing on the podcast too.
Yeah.
Um, but I was just thinking, if we really wanted to ape them, we could call our podcast "The Rest is Mystery."
Why would we call it mystery?
The rest is mystery, like the hidden God.
Oh, yeah. We'd have
That
to
wah,
we'd have to
wah.
like put up a 10-minute creamy episode on why we call our podcast that. I'm sorry.
Pretty much,
That's
no.
fine.
That's okay. It didn't land. My dad jokes don't always land, and that's okay.
Well, you are a dad, and I'm not. So
That's true. Well,
I'm
not
a
yet,
dog
but
dad,
you'll.
cat dad, but that doesn't count.
It comes with the territory. It'll happen.
Well, it is a good pod. I will say what James said. It is a very good podcast. It's called The Rest is History. Tom Holland, Dominic Sandbrook. I listed in that episode I did. I gave some of my favorite episodes or series from that podcast. The one they did on the late 70s, early 80s blackout in New York City was awesome.
Mm.
Well, I won't. I mean, I shared that and others. Just go back and listen to it. The
The
name of
French Revolution episodes were all absolutely
where
excellent.
I did not
Yeah.
listen to those. I need to. I know they were made in the past month or two.
Well, so I listened to the first half that came out last year, and they were all very, very good. And I think they were a good counter narrative to the sort of French nationalist narrative of, Marie Antoinette was a horrible human being. Like it came out right after the Olympics,
Mhm.
where there was a picture, or like there was a when they were scanning over the performers in the opening ceremony, like there was Marie Antoinette holding her head, and like people were talking about how evil Marie Antoinette was, and like they did a lot to counter that false narrative, the sort of history is written by the victors, and showed that Marie Antoinette was actually a deeply faithful queen, faithful to God, but also faithful to the French people, and showed the sort of nefarious underpinnings of the French Revolution. And it was really refreshing to hear that. because I think the French aren't really willing to honor that, and aren't willing to honor the fact that like people like Robespierre were horrible human beings,
You know?
um, and were responsible for a functional genocide of Christian clergy in France. And like the French Revolution really had very little redeemable about it. Um, but I digress.
No,
That's
it's
a
not
bee in my
digression.
bonnet.
I mean, most of the things I hear about French Revolution are just, and I read is just like, yeah, the unredeemable things, which it seems that there were just many, many, you know.
Yeah,
So it's but I will listen to it. I mean, but all to say is that The Rest is History is a great podcast. The banter, as James said, I mean, the back and forth, the humorous, I mean, that the dry Brit humor they just like, have between themselves is just so, it makes it so fun. Makes it so fun.
yeah.
Episode number nine, the ninth most listened to episode of our podcast is number nine, Preparing for the Ascent. Drew Keene, or Drew Nathaniel Keene, we should say, on the 1662 Book of Common Prayer International Edition. Um, this was, remind me, James, we did two episodes of Drew.
This
This
was the second one,
this was the second one without Sam.
right? Bray.
Right. This is just with Drew.
Yeah,
And he's a great guy. We're both gonna see Drew in February. He's gonna be at
right,
Anglican Way Conference in Savannah at St.
right.
John. This episode, I'm like, I feel sorry, Drew. I'm kind of my mind is blurred between the two episodes. I know we had a lot of good discussion, but I this
This
episode,
one was specifically on how to read the Book of Common Prayer, how to use the Book of Common Prayer,
yeah.
the volume that he and Sam put out this past year.
And this was the it's the 1662 prayer book, the classic Book of Common Prayer, which is
Right,
still like holds the official status in the Church of England as the Book of Common Prayer, even though they've had alternative supplemental liturgies they use for their Sunday services there.
right.
But this is the one. And I know this episode was on Drew Keene's companion he wrote to a very short companion on how to use that.
Yeah, it's like a primer.
Yeah.
Yeah,
So him and Sam Keys did I'm sorry,
Sam Bray.
Sam Bray
Yep.
did a uh edited an international edition because if you look at the 1662 prayer book, it has some things about crown and queen and king that just doesn't isn't relevant to modern day with the wider Anglican communion where we have Anglican churches in all kinds of places, North America,
Right,
yeah. And so this was a prayer book that modified some language, but very little. It was very conservative in whatever it edited or took out, and it retained the 1662 prayer book pretty much as it is. And then Drew Keene and Sam Bray wrote this companion to it. So, which is how to use it, how to go through it. And I remember reading the companion at the time. I read it through it shortly. But I mean, this is like months ago now, and so I'm kind of drawing a blank on what specific things from that companion I really thought, I will refer listeners to our episode about that. But yeah, it's made a lot of, waves in the wider Anglican world, man. Like
right.
people are it's like a bestseller,
The
the
IE. Yeah,
Greenbaum actual, not the companion. We're talking about the Greenbaum 1662 International Edition Book of
yeah,
Common. It's I mean, people from all over I mean, people that are really diving into Anglicanism for the first time, or kind of
right,
popular influencers in the Anglican world are really like, propping this prayer book edition up. And I would recommend, people to get. a copy of this. I have a copy of it here at my home because I'll go through and read prayers from it. And it's for its historical significance to Anglicanism and just, for what it is. It's
Yeah.
you know, what were you going to say, James?
Well, yeah. So I mean, it's an excellent the 1662 International Edition is excellent in and of itself, and I think it's certainly worth every Anglican having a copy for their own personal devotion. So that is one thing. The volume that Drew and Sam wrote uh, is excellent because it's not just a primer for the 1662 prayer book, it's also a sort of an apology for Anglican liturgy. But it's not like what you'll see in a lot of more contemporary Anglican churches, which is basically like, here's some Baptist theology that looks somewhat Anglican, you know. It's an apology for historical Anglicanism,
And by apology, you mean
defense,
not,
and
oh,
a
we're sorry for this. No, apology means defense of this.
right, yeah. Sorry, the lingo
You're good.
sometimes.
But I know we use that word apology all the time in our modern way
Right,
to mean something it doesn't mean what, yeah.
right, yeah. So they're offering a defense of or a um, support for historic Anglicanism with this. So that is very important. But then they go through the logic of each of the liturgies and sort of what they're supposed to be, and why they're there. And that ended up leading me to do a series, a teaching series at my church that I called the Bible and the Book of Common Prayer, talking about like um, one of the things that Drew and Sam say in that volume is they quote J.I. Packer and say the Bible or the Book of Common Prayer is the Bible arranged for worship.
Mhm.
And so, like, just going through each liturgy and showing its biblical focus, its biblical intentionality, its theological intentionality, and 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 giving a very clear, very clear historic Anglican perspective. I think it's a really helpful foray into exactly what we are sort of defending on this podcast, which is a historic Anglican perspective. Even when uh, maybe you or I don't always agree with everything about historic Anglicanism. I mean, I think we both would tend to land a little more in the Lutheran camp than the Reformed camp, um, but yeah. So I remember that episode very well. It was an excellent episode. And certainly, you should go back and listen to it.
Yeah. So go listen to that one. I just preparing for the ascent, Drew Keen on the 1662 Book of Common Prayer International Edition. Um, the next one, number 8, Luther, Calvin, and the Law. This is just an episode with you and I.
Yeah,
And that proves our theory of like people want to listen to you and me. Um, and I felt like that was one of those episodes, like probably like 75% of the episodes, maybe honestly. I just felt like didn't, I just kind of like my brain would just go in different directions throughout the
sure.
episode. Just words come out of my mouth and I listen back. I'm like, where was I going? My listeners definitely won't know where I'm going if I don't know where I'm going. Or maybe they will, I don't know. But
Yeah,
that was obviously by the title Luther, Calvin, and the Law. So we spoke about Martin Luther, we spoke about John Calvin, we spoke about the law. And the law, of course, by what we mean by that is the law in the theological distinction of the law and the gospel, and
right,
focused on the first part, the law, is in the law, God writes on our hearts of right and wrong, which became manifest to Israel in the Ten Commandments. And how do Luther and Calvin approach that?
right.
And what do they think the law does? What do they think the law is useful for?
Right.
Um, that's what the episode was about. I haven't listened to it in a while. I mean, I listened to it after we published it. I mean, I don't know if I listened to it since then, but
Yeah. Well,
uh,
so one of the things that came up is something that I think we should unpack more in a future episode, which is whether or not Luther believed in a third use of the law.
yeah,
And that's been a really sensitive topic within the Lutheran world. I mean, confessionally, if you are confessionally bound by the Book of Concord, you actually have to believe that Lutheranism, at the very least, teaches a third use of the law. But whether or not Luther did, I think, is an open question. And one of the things that I remember is that you and I actually sort of came at it from different perspectives. I
yeah,
won't necessarily say we disagreed, but
yeah.
I think that I still think that Luther, if Luther believed in a third use of the law, it would be more of an exhortation than a proper, like, the law is redeemed by the cross, and that might be more of a Calvin than a Luther,
Yeah.
um, and more of a Calvin than a Lutheranism, I think. Um,
Well, I think just to kind of break down, quick recap for the listeners, to kind of first and second use, uh, there's just some terminology of the use of the law. What is the law useful for? And the use, of course, the law is very useful for showing us where we fall short, showing us where we cannot fulfill the law
right,
perfectly. In our love to God, our love for neighbor, we cannot fulfill it perfectly. And when we read the Ten Commandments or we are confronted with that, basic, um, basic, fact that we don't live up to it perfectly, that shows us our need for salvation. That also, it brings us to a despair in order to, you know,
right,
recognize our need for something outside of ourselves to save ourselves.
right,
And I'm fully on board with that. I think that the third use of the law refers to the use of the law as in showing us um, the good to do, right? Because the Ten
right,
Commandments do encapsulate in many ways, how we do have a harmonious, common life together by, not killing each other, which Jesus would see in terms of hating each other, in
right,
Sermon on the Mount, or not committing adultery, not taking from one another things that don't rightfully belong to us, and taking something from our neighbor. It's and for me, I did sense we had some well, I wouldn't call it disagreement, but kind of different angles we came at it through. For me, I guess, I think it is, I agree with you. I think it is up in the air whether Luther believed in a third use of the law. I think he very well may not have, while also still avoiding the error of antinomianism. And I think
right,
I went at lengths of quoting him to say that, yeah, we're not held or condemned under the law anymore. But it's still relevant in a certain sense.
right,
So,
right.
sorry, those are my dogs barking downstairs. I don't know why. Uh, well, we'll let them bark for a little while. If they keep barking, I'll go down. So,
It's
so
okay. I think they can barely hear it. It's no problem.
yeah. If you can barely hear, they can. The listeners can't. So, it was a good episode, and again, I encourage our listeners to go back to Luther, Calvin, and the Law. I know we read some stuff from Institutes to see Calvin's perspective. I can't honestly remember what sections or what part
So I
was,
think
but
the big thing that we talked about was that Calvin inverts the ordering of Luther.
yeah,
And he says that the primary use of the law is what we would call the third use. For him, that's the first use, which is the law as a guide. And then he actually treats the second use, our, the Lutheran second use as well, which is the theological use or the law as a condemning word. Um, Calvin treats that as accidental in the scholastic or Aristotelian way of thinking, that it's not essential to the law, but rather is a sort of, it's not at the heart of what the law is trying to do. It's there as an accident. I mean, not like unintentional, but that it's not central. It just happens that the law condemns, but the law has always been intended to guide.
Mhm.
And so that's at the heart of covenantal theology as well, which we're going to get into when we talk about the episode with Theocast, I'm sure. And I just don't buy that. Um, because if the law was only really ever intended to be for the third use, then like when the law was given just a few chapters later, Israel was already breaking like the most important commandment of not committing idolatry.
Mhm.
um, if it's intended to teach, then it was not very effective at teaching.
Mhm.
So like for me, it seems pretty clear from the biblical witness that the law has always been intended to be there as a way of driving us to the grace of God, and not sort of giving us a standard that if we can just meet that, then we'll be okay with God, because that's
Right.
always been impossible.
Mhm.
And it's still impossible, but it's been achieved for us by Jesus.
Yeah. I think I think it, and again, I haven't listened to that episode maybe once since we recorded it, but I think I was very taken by Paul Althouse's interpretation of Luther's theology. Of course, and this is where also Althaus maybe went in his own direction.
Right.
Because when it came to a lot of primordial theology, I want to call it, like pre-fall theology,
Yeah.
Althaus took lots of liberties, especially very problematically when it came to the theology of folk, of certain ethnicities that have
Right.
certain locations apart from each other. I mean that lent itself to certain.
Abused by the Nazis.
Yeah, I was going to say certain vegan art. No, sorry, you're vegan. Vegetarian artists of Austria who later became German dictators.
Right.
But Althoff said, it's like the law and gospel that becomes a distinction post-fall, but that the law is something that is from the beginning, not like an afterthought, and that's a bit of a straw man, but like an something later that God puts us, or because humanity is fallen, now it needs a law.
Yeah.
That was, I mean, I was probably at the time we did that episode, I was probably knee deep in some Althoff stuff, not for my own personal
Right.
of him, but because of my studies of him. And so, yeah, it's kind of a vexing question of like,
Yeah.
when does law and gospel originate, and when we take in the account of the Genesis story of humanity,
Right.
and that's all things that I think we should grant kind of a broad, somewhat broad. It's like, we don't really know fully the, way it came about. But
Yeah. Well, and the thing, one of the things that I was going to bring in, but I forgot in that episode, is something I've thought about since then, which is Paul and his argument in Galatians saying that Abraham was justified by faith, because he was justified before the law came. Um, and so, I mean, that's not a Luther or Calvin argument per se, but that's a biblical argument that needs to be thought through.
Mhm.
Um,
Right.
and granted, there's law and then there's law, right? Um, for Luther, the law is not the Ten Commandments. The law is any commanding word that God gives, any imperative.
I think Luther even went as far as to say the Ten Commandments were like a statute. It wasn't even like divine law. It was divine law in a sense of like any civic law
Right,
has its divine origin. But yeah, he would say that was like an ethno national law for Israel at the time,
right.
you know, which would strike a lot of most Christians today is be like, oh, like that's crazy. Ten Commandments are eternal, you know, but yeah, that's yeah, the law predates that manifestation. Um, yeah,
Yeah, for
but
sure.
it takes the form of any because as Paul writes in Romans, the law is written on our hearts.
Right,
Just we know what's right and wrong. It doesn't mean we do it. It
right.
absolutely does not mean we do it, as we clearly see, but we do know.
Yeah. And that to wrap up at least my portion of this conversation, that's one of the things that the Reformed camp I think has gotten a little bit wrong, which is that there's such a heavy focus in Calvin and in Dortian Calvinism, so Synod of Dort, 17th century, um, and the Puritans as well. There's such a heavy focus on church discipline, um, that it creates its own kind of reformed legalism,
Yeah.
and I think that's one of the that's one of the ways in which Luther can be a corrective to Calvin and Calvin's theological descendants.
Um, Next episode is Catholic number seven, the most seventh most listened to episode, Catholic Luther Scholarship with Mickey Maddox. That was you were not there, James. That
No,
was a episode I had Steven on for. Um, I don't know if you listened to it or what you thought.
no,
Uh,
sorry, I didn't catch that one either.
uh, it's I will say this, the Catholic the 20th century Catholic reception of Luther um has given me certain pause as far as like my kind of natural inclination to just jump for these Reformation slogans and holding up high these platitudes of Reformation, which I wholeheartedly believe in because there were certain things, for one, I mean, it's come out in the episode. It's came out in the episode with Volker Lapine. Luther had lots of flaws as a person. Um, we should admit, as I think we would, we don't worship Martin Luther. We worship Jesus Christ.
Right,
Luther had flaws. He had, um, I would say, he there were things like where I think Luther and Melanchthon were on a better had a better attitude toward a lot of the dialogues and things that took place in the
right.
1600s as far as like, you know, trying to coming to a common understanding and to realize the church that Jesus envisioned of us being one.
Yeah,
Um, and so for one, I'd clearly admit that about like Martin Luther as a person as he was, but also like, Luther didn't have a 100% under, as far, much as the reformers and Erasmus and the humanists condemned the schoolmen as they were called, and
right,
the medieval theologians who were so enamored with Aristotle's philosophy that they felt that they could, you know, exhaustively explain God and everything rationally through an Aristotelian lens. I mean, obviously that was so mistaken in so many ways.
right.
But Aquinas had some good things to say,
Sure.
and Luther didn't always catch that. And many of the things Luther said about Aquinas were more so the things of later Thomas.
Right.
Um,
Yeah.
and to realize, the church at its best has always believed in prevenient grace. that grace, it always takes the operation of God on our hearts first before anything to turn us toward Him. That goes back to St. Augustine.
Right.
Roman Catholics, when they're at their best, believe that.
Right.
Protestants believe that.
Right.
And the medieval church lost a lot of that. And
Right.
um, there was a whole school of modern scholarship, a couple waves of it, Protestant and Catholic. A lot of them Roman Catholics, though, who took a sincere, genuine interest in Luther and wanted to see the good of what he had to offer. Who also said, look, there was some misunderstanding when the Reformation came about, and it wasn't through anyone's necessarily fault, but now as people 500 years later, we can look back and see, okay, there was some misunderstandings of that. And for people like Mickey Maddox, who converted to Roman Catholicism, and then from some of the people he talked about in that episode, Iserlo, I'm drawing a blank on Otto Hermann Pesch. These are people who were Catholics, remained Catholics, who took a huge interest in Luther, who would be critical of a lot of their own church's tradition of writing off Luther as the devil or
Right.
as the poster child of, dividing the church and breaking the church apart, splitting it, and all the cheap Catholic polemics that, emerged through, as a reaction to the Reformation. It made me see like, wow, like there's been a very responsible school of Catholic scholarship about Martin Luther that I was like,
Yeah.
I want to showcase this at some point. I want to showcase this because I don't want people to think that we're just some anti-Catholic podcast.
Right.
I mean, I have so many parishioners who, and I'm in South Louisiana, where, a lot of our parishioners are former Roman Catholics because that's so
Right.
prevalent culture here. And so like I don't want to come off as and I don't like a lot of there's lots of uh forms of Protestantism I cannot get on board with. I feel like a
Sure.
lot of Protestantism, and especially in modern day North America, resembles more the theology of the Anabaptists and the radical reformers than it does Luther and Calvin. And
Yeah.
so you know I want to like somehow communicate that to people like, look, that's like we're not a you know down with the Pope podcast. Like that's not what we're about. We're about focusing on the strengths of this, but not we're not trying to, you know. So I felt like having that voice of Maddox on the show was valuable in a way.
Yeah.
Oh, well.
There was another Roman Catholic Luther scholar, or he might actually have been a Bernard scholar, Franz Poset, who was pretty influential, if memory serves, from the Mark Mattis episode, was pretty influential on Mattis and his reading of Luther, or his reading of Luther's reading of Bernard.
Hmm.
Um, so, like, yeah, there is ample scholarship in the Roman Catholic Church that shows some of the best strengths of Luther, but a lot of the popular level, not academic, white ivory tower, but a lot of the popular level perspective on Luther is very antagonistic,
Yeah.
and I think it also doesn't do justice to him. It builds a straw man to tear it down. So it is, I think it is a helpful corrective to show the best of Catholic scholarship on Luther, rather than the old canard of Luther was an antinomian, or Luther was, um,
He
you
was
know,
a chronic uh, pervert, masturbator.
yeah,
I mean, you'll see. I mean, literally, I'm not like just being silly here. I'm like you go back to like 16th, 17th, 18th century, like polemical anti-Luther literature that a lot of Catholics wrote. Like he is, he was insane. He hated his dad. He had a huge guilt complex, and that is the only reason for the Reformation. And that's not the truth. And also that he was, yeah, lustful. That's why he married a runaway nun. Even though if you look at the historical record, he was very reluctant to marry. Like he had no
Yeah,
thoughts
he
of.
didn't want to
He
get married.
was like into his 30s, like I don't care. And like there's this woman like
No, he was into his 40s,
oh yeah, and there was Katie Von Bory's like he's trying to marry her to some one of his he's trying to find husbands for these
right?
like he had no interest in that, but he did. Um,
Yeah, and she
Probably
pursued
worked better
him.
when he got married to her, but it's
Yeah, she pursued him, which I think is actually really fascinating.
right. Um, and on this is a good segue because on the note, wow, on the note of the terrible polemical stuff against Lutheran Protestantism, our next most listened to episode number 6 was my our response is me, you, and Connor from Transcendent Truth. We responded to it was an episode, the response to John Martignoni. He wrote a book against Protestantism. He's like a yeah popular level Catholic polemicist. The book was
Yeah.
just we tore it apart. Um,
That's one that I wish we could go back and maybe go a little deeper into. Um,
and we can we have the
but
seat.
but I'm saying like in the initial conversation, um, I think it would have been helpful to if we had more time to actually dig a little more deeply into some of the arguments that he was making, because the thing that even threw me for a loop was he was eminently logical, but when you like dig beneath the surface, he, he was logical, but he was engaging in a lot of logical fallacies. So like you can follow his train of thought, but like one of the worst ones was um on this rock I will build my church. He said, well, Peter is clearly the rock, and Peter was the first pope of the Roman church. So, like, what other church could Jesus have been talking about?
Right. It's like the premises are accepted as totally sensical, and so therefore, yeah.
Exactly. And so that's what I mean. Like, I don't mean logical in the sense that, like, his logic is sound. I mean logical in the sense of he's following premise by
If you
premise.
accept the premises, yeah.
Exactly.
That's so much of popular Catholic apologetics. It is like as long as you accept the premises, these conclusions follow, but the premises are so like problematic, you know.
Right.
Just, I'm sure our listeners know all too well, but like I mean, there's so many of them. Gosh, there's some guy in Instagram. My wife, Rachel showed me. It was like one time we were it was early in the morning before we were going into work, each of us. She showed me this Instagram of like this Catholic influencer. Has a lot of followings on Instagram, YouTube. I don't remember his name, but he's got some like LARPy, crusade crap, that he has in his name or profile. There's so much of that. It's just junk. And
Right.
he's showing this clip from like the 2010s of some ELCA pastor doing the Sparkle Creed, that stupid woke
Oh, that wasn't the 2010s. That was like 2 years ago.
or whatever it was, that stupid
Yeah.
woke thing that unfortunately just, it's like they're taking like this, just, unfortunately, sadly, this, these mainline churches have been, you know, finding a sound bite, finding a video bite of this ridiculousness and showing,
Right.
and then like saying, see, we're the one true church, like this is what Luther started, blah, blah, blah. Like this is the dumbest argument that, and I'm like, for a lot of people, that probably sounds, they've never read Luther to know otherwise.
Yeah.
They, you know, they're seeing this ridiculous thing that this person is showing us a video of. And, it's like, yeah, there's a whole big world of Catholic apologetic influencers out there that I lament they're leading so many people astray because
Yeah.
just go read Calvin's Institutes, go read the Book of Concord or some of Luther's works, like some of his key
Right.
works, and you will know that it's, Rome ain't got a monopoly on sound, good, meet and right things. So
Right. I mean,
so
yeah, so like there was an episode that you did either with Jordan Cooper or about Jordan Cooper early on in the podcast.
I never had Jordan Cooper on. I
You didn't
would.
have him,
I'd have him on.
or maybe it wasn't an episode. Maybe it was just you sent me a video of him doing a rhetorical takedown on a Roman Catholic guy. Like he went through argument by argument in this guy's video where he was saying that Luther was the father of modernism and Luther was the father of
Oh,
communism and
yes.
like all of that kind of
All
stuff.
that crap. And that stuff,
And
popular Catholic apologetics repeats that trash. Yeah.
yeah, and none of like you can make that argument and argue it from a place of here are the accepted premises, and I'm going to throw them out into my echo chamber, and then I'm going to build an argument based off of these premises. Well, like you have to prove the premise that you're going to use for your argument if you want actually like people to trust what you're saying.
Yeah.
And that's the big problem with John Martignoni was that that he was willing to assume those premises from the very outset and to make really antagonistic arguments against Luther, against Protestantism, while not even building up his side first. Like the best apologetics don't leave anything to assumption. They explore every single premise before it's used as the foundation for something else.
Right. I
That's
agree.
what that's presuppositional apologetics specifically, if memory serves.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah. And
so the book is not worth your time because here's what's going to happen. If you read the book, you're going to get worried. You're going to get worried about, am I really believing rightly as a follower of Jesus? And in large part, it's because we are a people who are, um, you know, of the what Melanchthon refers to as opinio legis. We are a people who are of the opinion of the law. The law is constantly in our minds, constantly attacking us, and unfortunately gets into our conscience very easily and attacks us from there. And so when we hear the message of the free grace of God in Christ, it is so attractive, and yet also it has this little tendency to be repugnant because we want to be able to earn the grace of God. We want to be able to contribute. Otherwise, we feel like it's worthless. And so people like this popular level Roman Catholic apologist John Martignoni, they 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 play on that natural tendency that we have and say, well, of course you contribute to your salvation. I mean,
mm,
for goodness sakes, I saw somebody I went to seminary with today um, on his Facebook, on his stories, post a quote from himself saying, "Salvation is like a gym membership. You get it, but then you have to go. Like you have to work it out."
oh,
This is an Episcopal priest, and like this is the
grow
kind of
up
stuff.
that he has a congregation hearing that crap.
Yeah. So it's really unfortunate that that is the kind of stuff that we get and have gotten for so long. And that's why these Catholic apologists are so effective at getting people into the Roman Church because they play on that narrative that we've been fed for so long, and it people just end up giving in.
Mhm. Yeah.
But then what ends up happening, and then I probably need to go here in a second, but what ends up happening is you get a case like Audrey Assad. Are you familiar with her? I think I maybe have mentioned this before on the podcast or maybe in conversation with other people. I don't remember. But Audrey Assad was not raised in the church. She became an evangelical when she converted and then converted to Roman Catholicism. But unfortunately, what happened was when she started having trouble in her marriage and ended up getting divorced, everybody knows what happens then in the Roman church. And so she left not only Roman Catholicism, but now considers herself no longer to be a Christian. This woman, I should say, was a very well regarded contemporary Christian artist,
Mm.
CCM artist,
Yeah.
contemporary Christian music, and now she's no longer a Christian. And that is unfortunately the trajectory that a lot of people follow. They come into evangelicalism, they are wowed by the theology, but the theology in much of evangelicalism is no different than Roman Catholicism because it's all legalism. And then they find that their worship experience is missing a sense of structure, order, that sort of deep longing that every Christian has for something like that. And then they join the Roman Catholic Church and then find that it has more than its fair share of peccadillos. And then they end up sort of in the ether. They either lose their faith or they don't go to church anymore. And so like that pipeline, it doesn't always end in Rome. It's not everybody is Scott Hahn, you sort of the Presbyterian pastor who becomes a layman in the Roman church. A lot of it is evangelicalism, Roman Catholicism, atheism.
Mm.
And like that's what I want to see ended. If people want to go to Rome, fine. That's okay because they're still Christians.
Mhm.
But what I want people to hear is the gospel of the free grace of God in Jesus Christ, which is the gospel, period. Full stop. And that's what I want people to hear. I don't want people hearing that the gospel is God does a little bit and then you do the rest.
Right.
Because that's going to exhaust you. And in the end, it's going to make you lose your faith. Because there's no grace there, there's no good news there.
Right.
Here endeth the
Amen.
lesson.
Here ended the lesson, and that may end of the episode because it's a wonderful note to end on. It sounds like you have to go, James, and we have 5 more episodes to get through, and so this could be a two-parter.
Yeah, let's do it.
We'll make it. We'll put this up. Sure, I'll put this up, soon after. But we'll plan to come back. So, listeners, thanks for listening to Doth Protest. Listening to us go through the bottom 5 of our top 10 most listened to episodes of all time, kind of quote unquote, because we're going off not 100% data, but good data. And we will return to discuss. James and I will return to discuss the top 5, and it'll be another fun, great conversation. So God bless and take care.